Some names and details in this story have been changed for anonymity and confidentiality. Not all photographs are from the actual scene.
The Great Smoky Mountains National Park in Tennessee attracts millions of tourists every year with its endless spruce forests, misty gorges, and rushing waterfalls. During the day, these mountains seem like the perfect place for a relaxing family vacation, safe and predictable. However, at dusk, the dense thickets turn into a gloomy labyrinth that can swallow a person forever without a single trace. It is here, amidst untouched nature and the illusion of safety, that one of the most mysterious and terrifying stories in the United States criminal archives unfolded. 40-year-old Donald Nelson, his 38-year-old wife Suzanne, and their two sons, 12-year-old Billy and 8-year-old Raymond, were on a routine day hike. They were supposed to return to the cottage before dinner, but the forest took them forever. Not a single cry for help, not a single scrap of torn clothing on the branches, not a single sign of struggle on the damp ground. 72 months later, this perfect silence will be broken by a chilling discovery that will make even the most hardened detectives shudder. But it all started with an abandoned car in a forest parking lot and a phone call that started the countdown to the largest search operation in Blount County history. October 2010 was an unusually warm month in Tennessee. The Nelson family, seeking to escape the hustle and bustle of the city, rented a small wooden cottage called Blackwood Mill on the very outskirts of Townsend. 40-year-old Donald worked as an architect, and his 38-year-old wife Suzanne taught history. Together with their sons, 12-year-old Billy and 8-year-old Raymond, they planned to spend a week exploring the picturesque corners of the national park. October 14th began as a typical vacation morning. At 7:15, the family left the cottage in their dark blue SUV. Surveillance footage from a local ExxonMobil gas station provided the last documentary evidence that the Nelsons were alive. The video footage, dated October 14th at 7:42 in the morning, clearly shows Donald filling up the car while Suzanne buys 4 bottles of soda, a bag of saltine crackers, and several energy bars inside the store. The cashier, 22-year-old Megan Wright, later testified to police that the family was in high spirits. According to the witness, the boys were arguing about who would be the first to see the waterfall, and the father was asking about the condition of the dirt road leading to the parking lot. At 7:55, the SUV left the gas station, turning onto the highway to the entrance to the national park. Their goal was the popular Abrams Falls Trail. The trail, 5 miles long in both directions, ran along a rushing creek, winding through dense pine forests and steep, rocky slopes. It was considered scenic, but required caution due to wet rocks and constant elevation changes. The park's visitor logbook did not retain their signatures, but analysis of data from the nearest cell tower showed that Donald and Suzanne's phones last registered online at 9:20 in the morning, near the start of the route. After that, the signal disappeared. None of the Nelson family's devices ever connected to the network again. For the first 3 days, their absence went unnoticed. The alarm was raised by Martha, Suzanne's older sister, who lived in a neighboring state. On October 17th, after 10 unsuccessful attempts to reach her relatives, when each call went straight to voicemail, she contacted the Blount County Sheriff's Office. At 14 hours and 30 minutes, Marta officially reported 4 people missing. The response from law enforcement was immediate. At 16 o'clock that afternoon, a ranger patrol arrived at the parking lot at the beginning of the Abrams Falls Trail. They immediately identified the Nelsons' dark blue SUV among 24 other vehicles. The car was locked. Peering through the window, the rangers saw a child's fleece jacket in the back seat and a half-empty coffee cup in the front cup holder. There were no signs of a struggle, broken glass, or haste. The car was perfectly level, indicating that the family had arrived at the park in a completely calm manner. On the morning of October 18th, one of the largest search and rescue operations in the history of Great Smoky Mountains Park was launched. More than 80 rangers, 40 volunteers, 2 National Guard helicopters with thermal imagers, and 6 canine teams were immediately engaged in the search. The search area was rigidly divided into 2 square-mile squares. The rescuers combed through dense thickets, rappelled down deep, rocky crevices, and methodically examined the creek bottom and every foot of the forest floor. At night, the temperature dropped to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, making the chances of survival less and less with each passing hour. Specially trained German shepherds who had been given the opportunity to sniff out personal belongings from the Nelsons' rented cottage confidently picked up the trail from the SUV door. They led the search team along the main path along the river. However, at the mark exactly 1 mile from the beginning of the route, an inexplicable and eerie thing happened. 3 search dogs simultaneously stopped at a fork in the trail, circled in place, and sat down, whining loudly and refusing to go any further. The trail abruptly ended. There was only hard, stony ground around, covered with a layer of wet autumn leaves. Not a single broken branch, not a single shoe print, not a single lost item or drop of blood. It looked as if the 4 people had been lifted into the air. The search continued, uninterrupted, for 30 days. Rescuers expanded the radius to 15 miles, examined 53 natural caves and all abandoned hunting hideouts. Detectives interviewed more than 100 tourists who were in the park between October 14th and 17th. No one saw or heard anything. No witness could recall a family with 2 children on this particular route. The version of a predator attack was rejected immediately. A wild animal would inevitably leave a bloody trail, torn clothes, and scattered belongings. The version of an accident was also completely dismissed. It is physically impossible for 4 people to fall into an abyss at the same time without leaving any evidence of their presence, even the slightest. In mid-November, the active phase of the search was officially curtailed. The Nelson family's case became an unsolved one, weighing heavily on the desk of Detective Mark Harris. The family, including Martha, was left alone with the agonizing unknown, waiting every day for a call that never came. The forest swallowed the 4 people without a sound, safely hiding their bodies under the thick cover of silence. However, something about that sudden break in the dog's trail kept the investigators on their toes. Detective Harris returned to the photos of the empty trail again and again, feeling a cold shiver of realization. They hadn't just gotten lost. Someone or something was purposefully waiting for them in that pitch-black forest silence, acting so cleanly and professionally that it turned the disappearance of an entire family into a perfect crime, the secret of which was locked deep in the wilds of the Smoky Mountains. For 7 long years, the Great Smoky Mountains National Park kept its most terrible secret safely hidden. Time passed inexorably. The snows gave way to spring showers, and fallen leaves covered the ground with a thick, damp carpet every fall, hiding any possible clues. The Nelson family file had long since gathered dust in the archives of the Blount County Sheriff's Office. They became just a creepy local legend, a sad warning that rangers used to scare inexperienced hikers before setting out on a difficult route. However, the wild forest does not forget anything. It just waits for the right moment to give back to people what it once ruthlessly took away. This moment came in the hot summer of 2017. On July 12th, 3 students from a local university, 21-year-old Michael, 22-year-old Emily, and 20-year-old David, went camping. Seeking complete solitude away from the bustling crowds, The group checked in at the trailhead of the Booth Mountain Trail at 7 in the morning. Armed with professional gear and detailed maps of the area, the students expected an easy 3-day hike. According to the entries in their hiking diaries, the weather that morning was completely clear, and the temperature reached 75 degrees Fahrenheit. At about 13 hours and 45 minutes, after hiking more than 5 miles on the main well-trodden trail, the students made a fateful decision. Wanting to take a shortcut to a nearby ridge, they left the marked area and plunged rapidly into the untamed, wild part of the forest. Their path led through extremely dense, overgrown, and fallen trunks of centuries-old trees, where there was no hint of human presence. After 2 hours of grueling walking, the terrain changed dramatically. The ground sloped rapidly downward, forming a deep, gloomy ravine, completely hidden from the sky by a dense interweaving of branches. At 15 hours and 20 minutes, the tourists began a cautious descent to the bottom of the ravine. Emily later testified to the detectives on the record that she immediately felt a sharp, unnatural change in the atmosphere. The temperature instantly dropped by at least 10 degrees Fahrenheit. But the most frightening thing was the dead silence. Suddenly, the sound of the wind disappeared, and there was no bird song or rustling of small animals in the bushes. About 100 feet below, Michael was the first to notice the anomaly. There were strange, frightening structures hanging between the trees. Intricately woven branches, tightly bound together with time-darkened rope and dry vines. Their appearance aroused not scientific interest, but pure, primitive horror. The students instinctively wanted to turn back, but an inexplicable curiosity made them take a few dozen more steps forward through the gloom of the ravine. At 15 hours and 40 minutes, they came to a small clearing, in the center of which stood a massive, half-rotted oak tree. What they saw at its foot was forever embedded in their memory and caused many months of psychological rehabilitation for each of them. 4 human figures were tightly pressed against the thick, cracked trunk of the tree. They were sitting on the ground, their backs turned to the oak, forming a perfectly flat circle. Over the years, the remains had turned into pure skeletons, covered with a layer of moss and decayed leaves. They were securely fastened to the tree by thick nylon ropes and heavy metal chains completely covered in rust, which wrapped tightly around the chests and limbs of the dead several times. Miserable pieces of fabric that had once been clothing hung on the bones. The polymeric materials of the jackets retained their colors, dull blue and dirty green. These shades matched perfectly with the descriptions of the boys' clothes in the police reports. The size of the 2 skeletons clearly indicated that they were children. The skulls of the victims were unnaturally tilted back, staring empty eye sockets into the tall, dark branches. Panic gripped the group instantly. Without speaking, the tourists rushed out of the cursed ravine. During their escape, they left their heavy backpacks and expensive equipment at the bottom, scrambling up the steep slopes and tearing their hands to blood. It took them almost 2 hours of non-stop running to get to a higher ground, where a weak cell phone signal finally appeared. At 17 hours and 53 minutes, a Blount County emergency dispatcher received a hysterical, fragmented call from David, who pleaded for the police to be sent immediately. The next morning, July 13th, at 6:30, a special investigative team arrived at the coordinates provided by the students. The area within 1,000 feet was immediately cordoned off with yellow police tape. The work of the forensic experts at the site resembled a meticulous archaeological excavation and lasted more than 36 hours. The remains were incredibly carefully released from the chains, carefully numbered, and taken to the morgue in Knoxville. On July 16th, experts completed a detailed comparison of dental records obtained from medical archives 7 years ago. The match was absolute. The official police statement came as a bolt from the blue. The remains found in the thicket belonged to Donald, Suzanne, Billy, and Raymond Nelson. The family, which had been searched for weeks on end, was only a few miles from their original route. However, the joy of solving an old disappearance instantly vanished. The initial shock gave way to real, chilling horror as the forensic team began to work with the evidence. The nature of the bindings, the thickness of the industrial chains, and something else incredibly gruesome found on the very bark of the dead tree left no doubt. The Nelsons were not just lost in the fog. They were in the very center of something much darker, still breathing quietly in the black shadows of the forest. Friends, before we continue to dive into this eerie story, I would like to ask you to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and like this video. The platform's algorithms work in such a way that each of your reactions helps to promote this material. And thanks to your incredible activity, many more people will be able to see it. Your support is extremely important for creating new, in-depth investigations. Now let's get back to the dark woods. The case of the disappearance of a family, which had been gathering dust in police archives for years, changed its status in an instant. It was now an official investigation of a mass murder. An advanced team of forensic scientists from the police department descended to the bottom of the gloomy ravine. The area was instantly fenced off with a double ring of yellow tape, and powerful portable searchlights were deployed over the scene of the terrible crime, which forever dispelled the eternal twilight of this remote piece of forest. The lead investigator, District Police Detective Mark Harris, stood in front of the massive oak tree and realized clearly that the forest did not kill these unfortunate people. This was not a tragic accident, a natural disaster, or a sudden predator attack. The death that befell the family in this thicket had a completely human, yet incredibly disfigured face. The first thing that attracted the close attention of experts after examining the remains was the bark of the old tree itself. Right above the place where the skulls of the victims were located, bizarre symbols were carved deep into the wood. The signs did not belong to any known language or alphabet. They had an absolutely clear geometric structure. Intertwined sharp angles and deep furrows, which, according to the trace evidence, were carved with a sharp blade, with incredible physical strength and literally surgical precision. As the forensic team began to carefully remove the topsoil around the tree, the investigation took another sharp turn toward pure madness. 3 feet away from the trunk, forming a perfectly flat circle around the bodies, the experts found several heavy bowls of dark metal dug into the ground. Inside the vessels was hardened and melted black wax. Near the bowls, the ground was densely covered with small white fragments. Laboratory analysis quickly showed that these were the remains of small, local animals that had been killed right there. Meanwhile, inside the sterile walls of the county morgue, forensic experts tried to make the mute bones speak. The pathologist's report was laconic and extremely frightening. The experts found deep cracks in the skulls of Donald and Suzanne. The nature of the injuries clearly indicated that they had been struck with a blunt object. But the most important detail was that these horrific injuries had been inflicted while they were still alive. The couple had been brutally attacked before they were even tied to the tree trunk. The situation with the remains of the boys was much more complicated. Years of exposure to moisture and acidic soil had taken their toll. The doctors could not find any obvious signs of fractures or injuries from bladed weapons on the children's bones, making it almost impossible to determine the exact cause of their deaths. whether they died of severe dehydration, an unknown poison, or cardiac arrest due to the horror they had experienced. This part of the gruesome truth has forever dissolved in the darkness of the ravine. As Detective Harris laid out the photographs of bark marks, black metal bowls, and crushed skulls on the board, he felt a cold sweat break out on his back. All of these eerie elements, the absolute isolation of the site, the geometric precision of the carvings, the use of animals and black wax fit together flawlessly. The family was the accidental target of a carefully planned occult sacrifice. Mark Harris, as an experienced investigator, was well aware that such complex rituals are never performed just once. If there was a group hiding in these mountains, capable of killing 4 people in cold blood for the sake of a bizarre belief, they must have left other bloody traces in the past. The detective ordered an immediate pull of absolutely all police reports from the surrounding counties. He meticulously searched for any mention of strange rituals or nightly gatherings. And when the first loose archival folders landed on his desk, the investigator had no idea how deep into the abyss of real madness this next step would lead him. An atmosphere of paranoid concentration reigned in Detective Mark Harris's stuffy office. Realizing that the cold-blooded murder of the Nelson family could not have been a spontaneous act of aggression, the investigator initiated a total review of all police records in Blount and Sevier counties. A team of 6 analysts was given strict orders to pull up absolutely any reports, statements, or complaints from citizens regarding unexplained incidents in and around the national park between 2008 and 2010. At first, it seemed like a futile search for a needle in a huge haystack, as the mountains generated hundreds of reports of lost hikers, armed poachers, and dangerous encounters with wild bears every year. However, after 5 days of continuous work with the yellowed papers, the disparate fragments began to form a single, incredibly eerie picture that was hidden behind the facade of quiet provincial life. Harris noticed a series of extremely strange reports that local patrolmen usually casually wrote off as the antics of aggressive teenagers or predatory animals. It all started with the massive and unexplained disappearance of pets on farms directly bordering the forest belt. Later, the situation rapidly grew to a threatening scale. During the autumnal equinox of 2009, the police recorded 4 cases of horribly mutilated cattle carcasses. The nature of the wounds on the bodies of the dead animals left no doubt. It was the work of human hands. Someone had acted with surgical precision and a kind of ritualistic cruelty, completely exsanguinating the carcasses and leaving them at the intersections of dirt roads. The entries in the park ranger's logs were even more disturbing. Over the course of 2 years, at least 10 different groups of hikers reported fearfully of strange acoustic anomalies near the abandoned Meads Quarry. According to their testimonies, deep into the night, a monotonous, rhythmic singing of dozens of low voices could be heard coming from the old stone workings, accompanied by dull thumps that resembled a primitive drumbeat. The rangers who went to check these calls in the morning found only the remains of huge fires, charred bones, and puddles of molten black wax at the bottom of the quarry, identical to what forensic scientists had recently discovered at the roots of an old oak tree in the ravine. As Harris analyzed the arrest records from the area around the cursed quarry, he came across the same name over and over again: Arthur Clegg, a 52-year-old local outcast and former logger who lived in a filthy trailer on the very edge of the dense forest. Over the past few years, Clegg had been arrested several times for trespassing and vagrancy, but the most interesting thing was that during his last arrest at the end of 2010, he was hysterical, raving about some people in the deep shadows and begging the officer on duty never to let him go back into the forest. On July 22nd, the operatives tracked down Clegg and brought him to the police station. The man resembled a cornered animal. He was critically exhausted, with trembling hands, dirty clothes, and a wandering gaze full of primal terror. The interrogation, which lasted more than 7 hours in a cramped room without a single window, was carefully recorded on video. According to the recordings, at first, Clegg categorically refused to say a word. He huddled in the farthest corner of the room, muttering incessantly that those people can hear every rustle in the trees and see through the darkness. Detective Harris had to apply the most severe psychological pressure possible. He silently placed photos of crushed children's skulls from the ravine on a metal table. This visual shock finally broke the psyche of the old, marginalized man. The video recording of the interrogation clearly shows Clegg beginning to sob hysterically, clutching his head, and then, through his tears, he gives out information that makes the blood run cold. He spoke about a deeply secretive group of fanatics that local tramps whispered were called Satanists. According to the terrified witness, these powerful people were absolutely convinced that the ancient forests of the Smoky Mountains were a living, powerful organism that demanded regular, bloody tribute. In exchange for these gruesome offerings, the dark essence of the forest allegedly granted cult members absolute power, unlimited wealth, and supernatural longevity. Clegg swore that the killed animals were just a preparation, a kind of warm-up before the cultists moved on to the real hunt for living people who recklessly strayed on lonely paths. The investigator slammed his palm down on the table, demanding maximum specificity. Where exactly do these fanatics gather? Who is leading them? In a broken, barely audible voice, Clegg uttered a name that had never appeared in the county's official crime reports before: Pine Ridge Retreat. It was an old, extremely isolated mansion, safely hidden behind high fences in the most remote part of a wooded area a few miles from the city of Gatlinburg. The building was officially considered a closed private recreation center, with no paved roads leading to it, and the vast grounds were patrolled around the clock by armed guards with attack dogs. Clegg admitted that one fall, while searching for non-ferrous metal, he crept too close to the back fence of the mansion and saw expensive black cars with tinted windows drive in, one after another. Wealthy-looking people got out of the cars in silence and immediately put on long robes that completely hid their faces. From that day on, the former logger lived in a state of permanent panic, knowing for a fact that the cult members regularly combed the forest in search of witnesses. The testimony obtained dramatically changed the entire scope of the ongoing investigation. Mark Harris clearly realized that the police were not just dealing with a bunch of crazy vagrants, but with a well-funded, perfectly organized, and extremely dangerous structure. An organization that for years had been operating with impunity under the noses of law enforcement, having its own closed territory where no ordinary ranger had ever set foot. There was no more time for lengthy deliberations and coordination. After collecting Clegg's testimony and the archival files in a black folder, Harris walked quickly to the district judge's office. He desperately needed a warrant for an immediate assault and search of the Pine Ridge retreat. But as he pressed the cold doorknob of the judge's chambers, the detective had no idea that their heightened interest in the gated estate was no longer a secret, and the powerful owners of that dark place were well prepared to meet unwanted visitors. Obtaining a search warrant for private property belonging to a closed charitable foundation required a lot of effort from Mark Harris. However, the district judge, having seen the forensic photos from the forest ravine with his own eyes, and carefully read the transcript of Arthur Clegg's hysterical interrogation, signed all the necessary papers without any hesitation. The large-scale police operation was scheduled for the morning of July 24, 2017. At 3 o'clock, 15 minutes in the morning, a long column of black armored vans without headlights slowly moved along a narrow dirt road, sinking deeper and deeper into the dense forest of the Smoky Mountains. 45 SWAT team members had to be involved in the assault, as law enforcement officers had no idea what level of armed resistance might be waiting for them behind the high fence of the isolated property. The Pine Ridge Retreat Estate emerged from the thick pre-dawn fog like a massive fortress, although the building was supposed to resemble a classic recreation center. The high fence, equipped with state-of-the-art night vision cameras around the perimeter, and the sturdy steel gates were a clear indication that the residents valued their privacy. At precisely 4 o'clock in the morning, police snipers took up convenient positions on the hills around the estate, and the assault team used hydraulic tools to break the electronic locks on the gate as quietly as possible. The soldiers instantly scattered across the lawn, quickly and smoothly approaching the massive 3-story building. The penetration into the building was lightning fast. The crack of heavy doors being smashed in, blinding flashes of stun grenades, and shouts from tactical teams broke the morning silence of the forest. To the detectives' great surprise, no one even tried to offer armed resistance. The police detained 7 people in the luxurious rooms of the house, 5 men and 2 women. According to police reports, these people did not look like wild mountain sectarians or crazy hermits. They were well-groomed, dressed in expensive, comfortable clothes, and displayed a completely unnatural, deeply frightening calmness. None of the 7 detainees spoke a word as the operatives read them their rights and tightened the hard plastic ties around their wrists. The initial, extremely thorough inspection of all the living quarters did not yield any significant results. On the first and second floors, there were spacious living rooms with expensive leather furniture, a large library with classical literature, a modern kitchen, and several cozy guest bedrooms. Everything looked so legitimate and ordinary that Detective Harris briefly felt a cold stab of acute doubt. However, at 6 o'clock, 20 minutes in the morning, one of the experienced dog handlers urgently called the chief investigator to a spacious storage room on the first floor. The police dog, specially trained to look for human remains and traces of blood, was extremely restless and fiercely clawed at a massive oak panel built into the wall right behind the tall wine racks. After carefully examining the wooden panel, the operatives found a hidden mechanism. After pressing forcefully on an inconspicuous protrusion in the artistic carving, part of the heavy wall silently slid aside to reveal the entrance to a narrow concrete staircase leading deep underground. As soon as Harris took his first cautious step down, he was blasted with icy, stale air. The temperature in this hidden passageway was at least 15 degrees Fahrenheit lower than in the building itself. From below came the heavy, oppressive, and nauseating smell of old ritual incense, basement dampness, and the metallic taste of old, dried blood. After descending a staircase about 30 feet deep, the police found themselves in a huge room that had been methodically set up to look like a real, gloomy shrine. The room had no windows or natural ventilation system. The cold walls were densely curtained with thick black velvet, which instantly absorbed the bright light of tactical flashlights. In the very center of the basement stood a massive stone altar, its surface covered with hundreds of deep scratches and large spots of dark brown. Around the altar, the stone floor was lined with the same complex geometric symbols that forensic experts had found carved into the bark of an oak tree in a forest ravine a few weeks earlier. Along the right wall of the basement were metal shelves, the sight of which took even the most hardened fighter's breath away. Torture instruments were laid out incredibly neatly, like sterile instruments in an operating room. Clamps, surgical blades of various sizes, heavy rusty chains, thick nylon ropes identical to those used to tie the skeletons in the forest, and powerful portable stun guns. But the most terrifying discovery was waiting for Detective Harris in the far corner of the room, where a heavy antique desk made of solid mahogany stood. On this table, Next to the tall bronze candlesticks that retained traces of molten black wax was a thick ledger with a cover of worn dark leather. The detective opened it with extreme caution, having previously put on clean latex gloves. The yellowed pages were densely scribbled in small calligraphic handwriting. It was a detailed, cold-blooded diary of years of sacrifice. Opposite the exact dates of the autumn and spring equinoxes over the past 20 years were carefully encrypted lists of the so-called bloody forest offerings. Sturdy wooden shelves hung above the table, densely packed with clear glass jars and small cardboard boxes. It was a monstrous collection of trophies that cult members kept as a memento of each successful hunt. Harris methodically, breathlessly, examined box after box until his heart abruptly skipped a beat. Inside the small transparent box on a faded velvet cushion were two things. The first thing was a massive men's wristwatch with a broken protective glass, the hands of which had stopped forever. The second thing was an elegant silver pendant in the shape of skillfully intertwined tree branches. The investigator instantly recognized these items from the detailed descriptions in the case file from 7 years ago. The watch undoubtedly belonged to Donald Nelson, and Suzanne never took the silver pendant off her neck. There was no longer any doubt. The police were at the very epicenter of absolute evil. The 7 people who had been hiding behind respectable masks for years and were now silently handcuffed on the ground floor were the ruthless monsters who had brutally destroyed an innocent family. However, Harris, looking hard at the dates in the terrible leather book, clearly understood that the successful arrest of the cultists was only the beginning. The most difficult psychological test was ahead of him. To break them apart during interrogations and to reconstruct the exact chronology of that terrible October day, piece by piece, in order to finally find out how the perfect family vacation had quietly turned into a death trap from which there was no chance of escape. The interrogations of the 7 detained cult members began immediately after they were taken to the Blount County Detention Center in armored police vans. For the first 48 hours, the investigators faced a deafening, impenetrable, and fanatical wall of absolute silence. The detainees categorically refused food, water, and the services of state lawyers, staring at the detectives for hours with blank, glassy eyes. They seemed to be deeply convinced of their own impunity and the invisible protection of some higher dark forces. However, Detective Mark Harris, with over 20 years of service in homicide, knew the weakest point of any closed criminal group: a strict internal hierarchy and basic human fear. There are always leaders who give cruel orders in cold blood, and ordinary performers who sooner or later begin to panic for their own lives. Having made a professional bet on the youngest of the detainees, a 28-year-old private technician named Thomas, Harris offered him the only possible official deal: complete immunity from the death penalty in exchange for a detailed, minute-by-minute chronology of events. After 10 hours of continuous, debilitating psychological pressure, Thomas finally broke down. His testimony, captured on videotape on July 26th, allowed investigators to reconstruct the last hours of the Nelson family's life, step by step. According to the transcript of the interrogation, on October 14, 2010, influential members of the sect had absolutely no plans to kill this particular family. The Nelsons were an accidental, deeply tragic victim of circumstance, in the wrong place at the worst possible time. On that autumn morning, 3 rank-and-file cult hunters regularly patrolled the remote, physically challenging sections of the Abrams Falls Trail. Their main task was to find a lone hiker who could be easily neutralized and transported out of the national park completely unnoticed for the upcoming bloody ritual in honor of the new moon. However, At around 11 o'clock in the morning, safely hidden in a dense thicket of mountain rhododendron, they spotted what they considered to be the perfect target. According to Thomas, a family with 2 young children was considered, in their perverse philosophy, to be a pure, great gift that could bring unprecedented power. The cultists immediately began their silent hunt. For several long miles, they followed the Nelsons silently, keeping 50 feet parallel to the main tourist trail, completely blending into the deep, cold shadows of the forest thicket. At 1 o'clock 30 minutes in the afternoon, the unsuspecting hikers stopped for a planned long rest. They chose a very picturesque but completely isolated clearing near the very bank of a raging river. The sound of the mountain water perfectly drowned out the attackers' cautious footsteps, allowing them to get almost close to the victims. The ambush was lightning fast, extremely brutal, and completely professional. The victims had no chance to call for help. The attackers simultaneously used very powerful modified stun guns against the adults. Donald, guided by a basic parental instinct to protect, managed to stand up sharply and desperately tried to push one of the masked attackers away, but was instantly hit in the back of the head with a heavy river stone. The parents instantly lost consciousness and fell heavily to the damp ground, after which thick rags, heavily soaked with medical chloroform, were immediately pressed to their faces. The children, 12-year-old Billy and 8-year-old Raymond, were completely paralyzed with primal, animalistic terror. According to Thomas's incredibly emotional testimony, the pale boys did not even try to run or scream out loud. They just stood there, wide-eyed, watching their parents being dragged ruthlessly across the muddy ground into the bush. The attackers instantly taped the children's mouths shut with strong industrial tape and pulled their arms tightly behind their backs with nylon plastic cuffs. For the next 4 grueling hours, as the sun slowly sank below the horizon and the air turned freezing, the cultists and their paralyzed victims hid in silence in a deep natural crevice off the trail, patiently waiting for complete pitch blackness. At 7 o'clock 45 minutes in the evening, under the safe cover of the thick night, the cultists carried the bound family to the old dirt road, Rich Mountain Road, which was rarely used even by park patrol cars. A large, rusted cargo van with no license plates was waiting for them. The victims were carelessly thrown onto the metal floor of the truck and secretly taken to the same remote ravine, avoiding any lighted roads. It was at the bottom of this gloomy ravine that the main satanic ritual took place that night. Thomas, breaking down into a hysterical whisper, described to the police how the bodies of Donald and Suzanne were the first to be tied tightly to the trunk of a massive old oak tree with heavy rusty chains. The parents were killed first, forcing the children, paralyzed with terror, to watch helplessly as this bloody nightmare unfolded. After the ceremony was over, the bodies of all 4 were left tied to the tree as an eternal, unchanging gift to the dark forest. To prevent wild animals and birds from mutilating this terrible offering, the fanatics generously treated the bodies of the victims and the area around the oak tree with a special, aggressive chemical solution that reliably scared away predators. It was this gruesome detail that fully explained why the remains of the unfortunate family had been hanging in the open air for 7 years and remained almost untouched. Detective Harris, having listened carefully to these horrific details, felt a strong attack of nausea, but forced himself to maintain his professional composure. He slowly leaned over the metal table and asked Thomas the last, most important question. He asked sternly who had worked out this perfect cover-up plan to the last detail, who had been funding the secret base in the mountains for years without interruption, and who had personally given that final order to kill the Nelsons. The young cultist suddenly stopped crying, his breathing ragged, and his face turned white as a sheet of paper. Fearfully looking back at the heavy closed cell door, he whispered the name of the absolute leader of their cult. And when that unbelievable name rang out clearly in the silence of the interrogation room, Harris felt cold shivers run down his spine, finally realizing that the true extent of this bloody web led to a man no state police officer would have even dared to suspect of a crime until now. The name whispered, barely audibly, by the young cultist in the cold walls of the interrogation room, sounded like a real stunner to Detective Mark Harris. Throughout his long career, the investigator had become accustomed to looking for the root of the worst crimes at the very bottom of society, among chronic drug addicts, violent repeat offenders, and destitute, marginalized people hiding in the woods from justice. But this time, the invisible threads of the bloody web did not lead to dirty back alleys or abandoned trailer parks, but directly to the highest, brightest offices in the county. Richard Blake turned out to be the absolute leader, ideological inspirer, and main financial sponsor of the cruel cult. For all Tennesseans, without exception, this name has been an undisputed synonym for years of stunning success, stability, and an absolutely perfect reputation. 62-year-old Blake owned an extremely profitable chain of large hardware stores in Pigeon Forge. His face was constantly on the front page of local newspapers and in positive television news stories. He was an extremely generous philanthropist who regularly donated huge sums to children's hospitals, generously funded prestigious national park wildlife conservation funds, and, in what now seems like a sophisticated, incredibly perverse mockery, for years supported the families of police officers killed in the line of duty. Blake frequently hosted lavish charity dinners, shook hands with mayors and judges, constantly exuding confidence and utter integrity. However, behind this carefully and perfectly constructed social mask of a respectable businessman was an incredibly cold-blooded, calculating, and ruthless psychopath. According to detailed testimony from detained cultists, it was Blake who developed the dark ideology of primordial chaos from scratch. He had a phenomenal gift for psychological manipulation. The businessman did not recruit random people into his ranks. He purposefully sought out those with seriously broken psyches, those who were drowning in huge debts or had been suffering from severe addictions for years. Blake offered these unfortunates jobs in his numerous companies, fully repaid their bank loans, provided temporary housing, and then, step by careful step, completely subdued their will. He skillfully convinced these outcasts that they were, in fact, a superior, chosen caste that had received the sacred right to decide the fate of ordinary mortals by nature. Richard Blake's enormous, virtually unlimited financial resources provided the bloody cult with absolute security and invisibility to the law. It was through his intricate offshore shell companies that the very isolated estate in the mountains was officially purchased. His dirty money funded the purchase of state-of-the-art tactical equipment, powerful cell phone jammers, and high-end chemicals to perfectly cover his tracks at the crime scene. Blake, using his high-level connections in the administration, had constant access to the closed patrol schedules of the park rangers, allowing the cultists to move freely and with impunity through the forest, tracking down their lonely victims. Having received direct, documented evidence against the most powerful man in the area, Detective Harris was forced to act with the utmost secrecy and caution. On July 27th, at precisely 11 o'clock in the morning, a special task force, with no flashing lights or sirens on, quietly surrounded the Blake Corporation's headquarters in the heart of Pigeon Forge. As the heavily armed detectives swiftly entered the spacious, sun-drenched office on the top floor, Richard sat quietly behind his massive mahogany desk. According to the official arrest report, The businessman did not show a single drop of panic or animal fear. He slowly got up to meet the police and asked them as politely as possible about the reason for the unexpected visit. Even at the moment when the steel handcuffs clicked harshly on his wrists, Blake's face showed a light, arrogant half-smile of a man who is absolutely sure of his own impunity. While the prime suspect was being led out the back of the building under heavy escort, a team of experienced forensic scientists began a thorough, hours-long search of his perfectly cleaned office. At 14 hours and 15 minutes, a technician tapped the walls and discovered a fireproof safe hidden behind a massive bookcase, securely embedded deep in a concrete pillar. It took the police engineers more than 3 hours of hard work to carefully pick the sophisticated electronic lock without damaging the contents. When the heavy steel door finally opened with a dull click, there was no dirty cash inside, nor any secret flash drives with dirt on business competitors. There was only one item on the single metal shelf: a thick black photo album, tightly bound with a worn leather cord. Mark Harris opened its pages with extreme care, and the air in the luxurious office seemed to instantly turn to ice. It was a personal, carefully preserved visual diary of a ruthless leader. The yellowish pages were densely filled with original Polaroid photographs that still retained the faint chemical smell of the film. The last photographs, neatly dated with a black marker in October 2010, captured in minute detail the gruesome scenes from the same forest ravine. The camera's bright flash harshly snatched a thick, scarred trunk of a massive oak tree from the pitch-black night. The pictures clearly showed the mutilated bodies of Donald and Suzanne Nelson, already firmly tied to the bark with thick, rusty chains, down to the smallest folds of their dirty clothes. But the most terrifying, the most important piece of evidence in this horrific folder was a photograph of Richard Blake himself. He stood completely maskless, dressed in an expensive dark raincoat, right in front of his children, Billy and Raymond, who were tied to a tree, crying and completely paralyzed with terror. In this photo, the millionaire looked directly into the lens, holding a heavy ritual knife with dark spots in his right hand, and the same calm, infinitely cold half-smile of absolute evil shone on his face. It was the same irrefutable, ironclad proof of his direct, personal involvement in the murder that instantly destroyed any line of future judicial defense. When Detective Harris silently placed these gruesome Polaroid images on the metal table in front of Blake in the cramped interrogation room that same late afternoon, without saying a word, the investigator sincerely expected to finally see a breakdown, a panic attack, or a hysterical demand to call his lawyers immediately. However, the respectable businessman did not even blink an eye. He only slowly leaned forward, so close that the chains on his hands rattled loudly, looked at the exhausted detective with his empty, faded eyes, and in an absolutely icy, even tone of voice, uttered a single short phrase that made Mark Harris involuntarily shudder, finally realizing the incomprehensible depth of the abyss that justice faced in these mountains. On February 20th, 2018, the Knoxville District Court building resembled a real fortress under siege. The case of Richard Blake and his sectarians, which was loudly called the Smoky Mountain Massacre in the press, became the most high-profile and large-scale trial in the history of Tennessee. Hundreds of reporters from national TV channels, dozens of satellite communication vans, and crowds of outraged locals were on duty around the clock outside the massive courtroom. Unprecedented security measures included metal detectors on every floor, dog handlers, and dozens of armed tactical units, All those present clearly understood that in the dock was not just a serial killer, but an incredibly powerful man who had for years shaped the facade of local government and high-profile charity, reliably hiding behind it absolute, inhuman evil. Blake's defense team, consisting of 5 of the most expensive attorneys in the United States, chose a predictable but highly aggressive strategy. First, they filed a formal petition to declare their client insane, claiming that he suffered from a severe form of schizophrenia with profound delusions of grandeur that allegedly completely deprived him of the ability to distinguish right from wrong. When an independent state psychiatric examination categorically refuted this diagnosis, officially recognizing Blake as a perfectly healthy and extremely calculating sociopath, the defense abruptly changed its line. The lawyers tried to shift the blame to the younger members of the cult, cynically claiming that the wealthy businessman was only a spiritual patron who could not even imagine the real bloody crimes of his uncontrolled fanatical followers. However, the experienced district prosecutor methodically and ruthlessly destroyed every false argument of the defense. The main trump card for the prosecution was the documented testimony of the henchmen, including Private Thomas, a technician who made a deal with the investigation and under oath recreated in detail the gruesome chronology of that October day in 2010. On the large monitors in the courtroom, the gloomy leather Book of Gifts, with encrypted records of the rituals, was shown page by page. But the real emotional peak of the trial, which forever deprived the defense of any chance of acquittal, was the publication of the original Polaroid photographs found in the businessman's hidden safe. When the prosecutor silently displayed a photo of Blake with a bloody ritual knife against the background of children tied to an oak tree, a dead, oppressive silence reigned in the crowded courtroom. Several jurors were openly weeping, averting their eyes from the horrific image, while Richard Blake himself sat with his back straight, showing absolutely no emotion. The trial lasted 4 long months, turning into a grueling marathon for the entire state. On May 17th, at 15 hours and 20 minutes, the jury retired to the deliberation room to reach a final decision. The journalists had been preparing for days of deliberations, given the huge volume of case materials, but the verdict was reached incredibly quickly. It took the jury only 4.5 hours to reach an absolute unanimous agreement on each charge. The chief judge, reading the verdict in a firm voice, called the defendants' actions the epitome of the purest cruelty that has no right to exist in the civilized world. Richard Blake and 3 of his closest organizational associates received the maximum possible punishment: 4 consecutive life sentences in a maximum security federal prison without any right to parole or appeal. Other ordinary members of the satanic cult, depending on the proven degree of their involvement in the kidnappings and concealment of evidence, went to prison for terms ranging from 20 to 40 years. In the front row of the courtroom, right behind the prosecution table, Marta, the older sister of the murdered Suzanne Nelson, has been sitting for all these long months. The woman, who had lived in a state of unbearable anticipation for 7 years in a row, listened to the harsh verdict with her eyes tightly closed. Witnesses noted that when the judge said the word life, she did not show any violent joy, but only clutched a small silver frame with the only family photo in her hands until her knuckles were white. For her, this historic day was not so much a day of great triumph for justice, as it was the last, extremely difficult step in the long process of realizing the irrevocable loss of her closest people. In early June of 2018, after all the mandatory legal and bureaucratic procedures were completed, the remains of the Nelson family were finally, officially, handed over to their relatives for a proper burial. The ashes of 40-year-old Donald, 38-year-old Suzanne, 12-year-old Billy, and 8-year-old Raymond were carefully placed in 4 urns and secretly transported to Asheville, the city where Suzanne was born. The farewell ceremony at the old municipal cemetery was extremely quiet and completely closed to the press. There were no loud speeches, just a few dozen of her closest friends gathered in silence under the shade of large weeping willows. The county police also sent a large wreath of white lilies as a sign of deep respect and remembrance. The Nelson family, whose perfect autumn vacation turned into a darkest criminal nightmare, finally found their eternal rest under one large granite monument, forever leaving the cold, blood-soaked thicket of the Smoky Mountains that had held them in its deadly thrall for so long.